Guys, I'm bringing the party to you.
Hello there, and welcome to the scruffy-looking Nerd Herders podcast. I'm your host, Tyler, bringing you news on all things nerd and geek-related. But this week is a special episode. Last week, I talked about doing something a little bit different with this episode, and so I'm doing an episode that's kind of like a history of / deep dive of my personal favorite comic book character, Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. So in this episode, like I said, it's going to be different. I'm not going to be covering news and stuff like that with like the gaming industry and movie news, comic news and all that. This is strictly a dive into the history of Iron Man, and once I discuss like the comic book history of him, I'm going to touch on the Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Tony Stark / Iron Man, and kind of giving a comparing and contrast of how they handled the character. And I'll also have a couple of listener questions about this. So here we go. So starting off with the concept / origin. So Iron Man is of course a Marvel Comics character, and his first appearance was in Tales of Suspense issue number 39 in March of 1963. He was created by 4 people: Stan Lee, Don Heck, Larry Lieber, and Jack Kirby. And Kirby was actually the designer of Iron Man, as he had to do the cover art for the comic first, because that's typically how they did it back then. The cover artist would do the cover art first, and then the interior artist would then do the interior comic panels. So Iron Man's real full name is Anthony Edward, aka Tony Stark. He has several team affiliations, one being the Avengers, which is his most popular one, Department of Defense, Force Works, New Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, the Illuminati, the Mighty Avengers, S.H.I.E.L.D., Stark Industries, Stark Resilient, Thunderbolts, and probably a bunch of others that I'm not remembering, but those are his most popular ones. His partnerships are usually with War Machine, Rescue, and Ironheart. His abilities is, number 1, a genius level intellect. The guy is super smart. He's a proficient scientist and engineer. His powered armor suit, superhuman strength and durability, supersonic flight, energy repulsor and missile projection, and regenerative life support. So it's extremely interesting to know the origins that Stan Lee had when coming up with the character of Iron Man. In 1963, Lee was toying with the idea of a businessman superhero, and he wanted to create a character that represented the thing that the young people hated the most, which was like war profiteering, industrialism, etc., and, quote, shove them down their throats and make them like him. Which it worked. Now, while Stan intended to write the story himself, unfortunately he had to pass the story writing on to Lieber due to a deadline. The art was split between Kirby and Heck. Like I said, with Kirby doing the cover, he designed what the armor would look like, and Heck was able to create what Stark and Virginia Pepper Potts looked like. I bet you didn't know that Pepper's first name is actually Virginia, huh? So Lee set out to make the new character a wealthy, glamorous ladies' man, but one with a secret that would plague and torment him as well. Writer Jerry Conway said, "Here you have this character, who on the outside is invulnerable, just can't be touched, but inside is a wounded figure. Stan made it very much an in-your-face wound, his heart was broken, literally broken. But there's a metaphor going on there, and that's, I think, what made the character interesting, which I am inclined to agree with. That's one of the reasons why I personally felt so attached to the character of Tony Stark, was because he always had up a front, but on the inside he was tormented. He was constantly battling inner demons, which, speaking of demons, I'll touch on that a little later too. So Lee based this playboy's looks and personality on Howard Hughes, explaining Howard Hughes was one of the most colorful men of our time. He was an inventor, an adventurer, a multi-billionaire, a ladies' man, and finally, a nutcase. Without being crazy, he was Howard Hughes, Lee said. Throughout the character's comic book series, technological advancement and national defense were constant themes for Iron Man, but later issues developed Stark into a more complex and vulnerable character as they depicted his battle with alcoholism, as in the Demon in the Bottle storyline, which I'll kind of touch on later, and other personal difficulties. Lee and Kirby included Iron Man in the Avengers issue number 1 as a founding member of the superhero team. The character has since appeared in every subsequent volume of the series. So, I'm going to do the original origins of Anthony Edward Stark, and then I'll go back and I'll discuss a more recent retcon that hasn't really been a fan favorite, but for me, I kind of on the fence for it. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I'll touch on it later. So, Anthony Edward Stark is the son of Howard Stark and Maria Stark. Tony had a strained relationship with his father. Howard's battle with alcoholism would cause him to be verbally abusive to Tony, which would lead Tony to turn to robotics as an escape. He was a boy genius, and he entered MIT at the age of 15 to study engineering, and later receives master's degrees in engineering and in physics. At the age of 19, his parents are killed in a car accident, and he inherited his father's company, Stark Industries. Within a few years, he had turned it away from a weapons manufacturer into a multinational corporation firm that would be a leader in scientific research. He would also eventually purchase the company that made the car his parents were driving in, as he finds out that it was a faulty brake line that caused them to crash. But later you find out, unknown to Stark, it was due to a rival company, Republic Oil, later to be Roxxon Oil. Not done by the Winter Soldier as it was shown in the MCU, but I really thought that was a good segue into intertwining their stories. Anyway, lacking business skills, Tony promoted Pepper Potts and gave her the majority of the workload because he just saw it as a burden. Tony's new life as a CEO provided him with new challenges, but as the company grew bigger, his job became less exciting, and Tony fell into self-indulgence once again. So, the origins of his Iron Man armor. While overseeing a military demonstration of his technology in Afghanistan, which, side note, writers have updated the war and locale in which Stark is injured, and in the original 1963 story, it was during the Vietnam War. In the 90s, it was updated to be the first Gulf War, and in the 2000s, it was updated to be the war in Afghanistan. Just a little side note there. So, while he was in Afghanistan, Tony tripped a booby trap that killed his escort and lodged shrapnel into his chest. Stark was taken captive by the terrorist leader Wong Chu, who was working with the Mandarin. So, Wong Chu falsely promised Stark that if he built him a powerful weapon, he would be allowed to undergo an operation to save his life. Even though Stark realized the tyrant was lying, he agreed, hoping to gain time and access to the tools. His fellow prisoner, Ho Yinsen, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who Stark had greatly admired during college, constructs a magnetic chest plate to keep the shrapnel from reaching Stark's heart. In secret, Stark and Yinsen use the workshop to design and construct a suit of powered armor, which Stark then uses to escape. During the escape attempt, Yinsen sacrifices his life to save Stark's by distracting the enemies as Stark recharges. Stark takes revenge on his kidnappers and rejoins the American forces on his way, meeting a wounded American Marine fighter pilot, James Rhodey Rhodes, who had been shot down in his helicopter. By working together, they were able to escape and arrive back in the United States. Upon returning, Tony realizes that he has limited time left due to his injury and is forced to keep the chest plate designed by Yinsen to sustain himself. So, Tony decided to make the best of it by making improvements on the technology and the power of his armor. He was able to reduce the chest plate's size and weight so he could wear it under his normal clothes, like his sharp tuxedos and suits and all that sharp-looking stuff that rich people wear. After designing the armor suit to match the lighter chest plate, he made the existence of his suit public. He concealed the origin of the armor, however, and the fact that he needed the chest plate in order to continue to live. So the start of him becoming a superhero was when he finally revealed what happened to him in the war zone to his fiancée at the time, and together they attended a tennis match in Forest Hills, New York that afternoon. Stark brought along his armor, which he was taking to a nearby laboratory for tests. Then terrorists threatened to kill everyone present at the match, and Joanna urged Stark to don the armor to stop the terrorists. Stark did, captured the terrorists, and saved the spectators by throwing himself atop the bomb, then making Iron Man publicly a hero, and Stark had a new sense of purpose, having decided to combat evildoers as Iron Man. Then, while testing his super special Stark race car, Tony wound up in a wreck. Then he was saved the last minute by ex-boxer Harry Happy Hogan, and to repay Happy, Tony hired him as his personal chauffeur. Although Happy eventually became more like a bodyguard and started resenting Iron Man because he thought Iron Man was taking away his work. Hogan fell in love with Tony's secretary, Pepper Potts, whom Tony eventually fell in love with as well. Even though Potts reciprocated Tony's feelings, she eventually ended up marrying Happy Hogan. During this time, the original Crimson Dynamo attacked Stark Industries, but Stark persuaded him to defect, because it was during the time of the USSR and to defect to the United States. Anyway, Stark faced off for the first time against the Mandarin, who would become one of his most recurring enemies. Later, he would expand the scope of his activities to battle any force or person who threatened the security of America. Stark was instrumental also in the organization and the armament of the original global intelligence and law enforcement agency known as S.H.I.E.L.D. After Thor, Hulk, Ant-Man, Wasp, and Iron Man all defeated Loki together, Ant-Man suggested that the five of them stay together as a team, and the Wasp dubbed them the Avengers. Now, Stark donated his Manhattan mansion to the Avengers for their exclusive use, and shortly afterwards, after a fight with the Space Phantom, the Hulk decided to quit the team since he thought no one trusted him. Cue sad Hulk music. While in pursuit of the Hulk and Namor, the Avengers came upon the body of Captain America, the legendary World War II fighter. The Avengers accepted him into their ranks, and he became close friends with Iron Man, and Iron Man even gave Captain America transistors to control the flight of his shield after he would throw it, even though Captain America later just threw them away since he said they ended up to upset the balance of the shield. After a fight with the original Masters of Evil, which ended with Baron Zemo being killed, Iron Man, Giant Man, Wasp, and Thor all decided to leave their teams of the Avengers as they needed a break, and Captain America stayed on and became the new leader of the Avengers. And I personally feel like even though I really like Iron Man, he's not a leader. He's he makes brash decisions. He always rushes into stuff. He's not calculated. And he kind of he's like a fly by the seat of his pants kind of person. Whereas Captain America, I feel like, is a perfect leader for the Avengers because he has like that military mind, and he can strategize, he can plan, he knows everyone's strengths and weaknesses, and he knows how to boost someone's weaknesses with another team member's strengths. So I feel like that was a good idea for Marvel to put Cap as the leader. Over the years, Stark constantly refined and modified the designs of his armor. From a bulky transistorized iron suit, he eventually built a relatively lightweight integrated circuit, magnetically polarized suit with more human-looking articulated musculature. His extraordinary genius in theoretical mechanics enabled him to keep his suit of armor state-of-the-art. He eventually underwent heart transplant surgery as well, so that he would no longer be obligated to wear his metallic chest plate. In the wake of the Kree-Skrull War, Stark initiated a meeting in Wakanda with Professor X, Mr. Fantastic, Black Bolt, Doctor Strange, and Namor to form a clandestine, unnamed group to devise strategy and policy regarding overarching menaces. They later became known as the Illuminati. Stark's original goal was to create a governing body for all superheroes in the world to answer to. However, the different beliefs and philosophies, beside the fact that many heroes chose to conceal their real identities, made Stark's plan impractical. Despite this, though, the group agreed to share vital information that they would come across. But soon, Tony would face his greatest enemy ever, which would be alcohol. Tony became the victim of several corporate takeovers, and he would lose and rebuild his fortune multiple times. when his company, which had changed its name from Stark Industry to Stark International, was threatened with the takeover at the same time he was experiencing oppressive personal problems. Tony began to abuse alcohol again. Although he managed to recover quickly from his first serious bout, the compulsion to drink remained a constant temptation. The second time he succumbed to his alcoholism, due to even more devastating personal problems than the first time, Tony went on a several-month binge, during which he was cheated out of Stark International, had all Iron Man suits destroyed except for one, lost the leases on his various apartments, and had his personal assets frozen so that he could not touch his fortune. All of this was the result of the mysterious entrepreneur Obadiah Stane, who took over Stark's company, renaming it Stane International. During this time, Stark's friend James Rhodes, old Rhodey, who had gone to work for Stark after leaving the military, assumed custody of the Iron Man armor and operated as Iron Man in his stead. When Stark finally regained his sobriety, him, Rhodes, and two of his friends, Moreland Irwin, and his sister Clytemnestra Irwin of Richmond Enterprises, got together to set up a new electronics firm in California named Circuits Maximus. In his brief existence, Circuits Maximus became a prestigious and successful firm. Jim Rhodes, over the course of having the Iron Man armor in his custody, became increasingly enamored with being Iron Man, and upon Stark's return to sobriety, feared that Stark would ask for it back. The cybernetic helmet had never been properly calibrated to Rhodes' brain patterns, so he began to have serious headaches and his thinking was clouded. As a result, Rhodes began to manifest hostility towards Tony, and as part of his therapy, Stark constructed a simple suit of armor based on his original design with no intention of donning it until he felt in control of his alcoholism. So Rhodey eventually succumbed and just goes on a rampage. This caused Tony to use that prototype armor that was not yet finished in order to stop Rhodey from causing any more destruction. Following this incident, Rhodey repeatedly tried to convince Tony to resume Iron Man's mantle, but Tony kept saying no. Somewhat fearful of his past alcoholism and how Obadiah Stane had taken advantage of it, Tony felt that he had grown dependent on the armor and felt he had rotted on the inside. As a result, Tony didn't feel worthy to wear high-tech armor, and Rhodes used it and relied on the super armor more and more, now following this incident again. And as I said, he was trying to convince Tony to take the mantle back, and Tony just didn't want it. But eventually, Tony developed a brand new suit of armor and nicknamed it the Silver Centurion. And this was a suit of armor. I didn't really care for this one, but it still looked pretty rad. But he had been working on this for months, and it had been a secret project, and he finally confronted Stane face to face. However, soon after the completion of his Silver Centurion armor, Obadiah Stane became alarmed at Stark's steps towards recovery, and Circuits Maximus was bombed, injuring Rhodes and killing Morley Irwin. Wanting vengeance, Stark then used his untested armor and sought out Stane. Stane himself put on his suit his engineers had built using Stark's plans, and met Tony in a battle as the Ironmonger. Losing the battle against Stark, and feeling too prideful and not wanting Stark to win, Stane committed suicide. He just churned his blasters on his own head and blew his brains out. And then Stark decided that although he would never be cured of alcoholism, he could not deny his responsibility of being Iron Man. So he resumed his career as Iron Man and joined the new West Coast branch of the Avengers. After managing to reclaim the control of his fortune, he did not want to claim ownership of his former company, Stark International. He founded a new technological design and manufacturing company, Stark Enterprises, based in Silicon Valley in Northern California. Stark Enterprises quickly became a successful and innovative company. So now we're going to get to the the comics that I grew up reading of Iron Man. These were my first event, I guess you could say, with Iron Man. These were the first ones that I read. So, and I'm really upset that I don't own these anymore. So all of this builds up to the famous event called Armor Wars. It was first known as Stark Wars, but is more commonly known as Armor Wars now. So Stark learned that an industrialist calling himself Spymaster had stolen plans for many of his secret technological innovations found in the Iron Man armor. Spymaster then turned over these plans to Stark's most powerful business rival, Justin Hammer, who in turn sold them to criminals. So, with so many people gaining access to Stark's armor designs, Tony had to figure out a way to stop all the misuse of his armor technology. He would eventually develop a way to disable the armors of anyone who used any kind of technology based on his designs, and thus began the Armor Wars. So, during this, he accidentally killed the second Titanium Man in the course of this armor war. And it was basically, Titanium Man didn't use his armor plans. It was like a misinformation that Tony had. So the U.S. government branded him an outlaw as a result of that and other vigilante actions. And his longtime Avengers comrade, Captain America, was among those opposing him. So that opposition that you would feel in like the first Avengers movie and a little bit more in Age of Ultron, and then especially in Civil War, that butting heads that Tony and Steve Rogers has, it goes way, way back. So, I mean, it was back in the comics for a while. So Stark publicly claimed that he had fired Iron Man in displeasure over his illegal activity. He even went so far as to create a false history for a Randall Pierce, allegedly the original Iron Man's identity, which he turned over to the government. Shortly afterward, though, Iron Man was apparently destroyed in combat with U.S. government forces. And like I said, Cap this whole time had been trying to persuade Tony from not taking on the U.S. government. And so Tony pretended to comply, but like I said, in the end, he continued his crusade, going as far as to electrocute Captain America. And once Captain America tried to stop him physically, although Cap wasn't hurt badly in any way, this actually just created more friction between the two of them, which lasted, like I said, in each of their titles for quite a while. So Tony is continuing to use his Iron Man armor despite all this, and he discovers that its interface design was causing severe damage to his nervous system. So he began remotely controlling all the Iron Man armors, and after a failed mission against the Masters of Silence, he realizes that controlling the Iron Man armor is not as effective as being inside of it rather than just manually controlling it. So this leads Tony to design the War Machine armor, actually calling it the Variable Threat Response Battlesuit. Now, inside this suit, his nervous system would continue to deteriorate, however, even to the point where it began life-threatening. So Tony had to fake his own death again. Later, Kathy Dare, a former lover of Stark's, had grown completely unstable and shot him. The gunfire severely injured Stark's spine, and it appeared he could be crippled for the rest of his life. However, he would still function normally within his Iron Man armor. A microchip device that he later implanted in his spine enabled him to walk and move normally once again. This biochip proved problematic and degenerative nerve damage occurred. This was aggravated by the attack of Kirsten DeWitt, a madman who claimed Stark had stolen his father's designs. DeWitt had Stark's nervous systems attacked with a techno-organic virus, but Stark was able to survive. He temporarily had to be placed in cryostasis, so he was in cryostasis, and James Rhodes took his place as CEO. Soon after recovering, Stark was injured from feedback from a telepresence system to remotely control his Iron Man armor and battle Ultimo. Stark eventually recovered after extensive rehabilitation. So this eventually leads to my definitely not my favorite Iron Man storyline. So this story, it's okay. So Tony Stark is revealed as an unwitting traitor to the Avengers while under the control of Kang the Conqueror. Now, the reveal that Kang the Conqueror had actually been using Stark as an unwilling undercover agent for several years, I just really hated it. But Kang used Iron Man to kill many innocent lives and other heroes such as Rita Damara, who is the second Yellow Jacket, and other Avengers teammates. So the Avengers got their asses kicked by Tony Stark, and they decided that who's the only other person that could defeat Tony Stark, and it was a teenage Tony Stark. So The Avengers traveled back in time to recruit a teenage Tony Stark at 19 years old to fight present-day Tony Stark, and I feel like so it's just the storyline. It was just like so the young Tony Stark is able to steal an Iron Man armor from his older self and use it in battle against him. And during the battle, the present-day Tony Stark would regain his memories and realize that he had been forced to do basically murder, and as a result, he ended up sacrificing himself in order to kill Kang the Conqueror. So the teenage Tony Stark would stay in the present timeline following Iron Man's death and continued his life as the new Iron Man. The young Tony remained at Avengers Mansion, and he enrolled in school, and so people were like, oh, your name's Tony Stark, and he's like, oh, it's no relation. And everyone would just be like, oh, you're Tony Stark, and he's like, nah, it's no relation. I just don't get why he didn't go by a different name. Moving forward from that, which that was a section of Iron Man history that even Marvel tries to forget. They just try to pretend it just didn't happen. There was a time period when Iron Man was fighting Mentallo, and he defeated him, and so he took advantage of Mentallo's global mind control device to erase all knowledge of his often compromised secret identity from every person on Earth. Then he just revealed it to the people he deemed trustworthy, causing them to remember the memories he had buried. And then, while fighting Whiplash during a storm, Iron Man's armor became sentient. This would later be revealed to be due to the Ultron Imperative. The safe armor developed a feeling of overprotection and tried to replace Stark, but ultimately sacrificed itself to repair damage to its creator's heart caused during a fight. After this experience with the sentient armor, Tony suffered an uncharacteristic bout of technophobia and decided to give up being Iron Man and Tony Stark. He gave away his fortune and adopted the persona of Hogan Potts. And posed as a simple worker at Askew Electronics, incorporating a new alloy called Skin into his armor designs. SKIN. It's like acronym. After a test run against the Shocker, Iron Man faced AIM, the Ghost, and finally Ultron after the villain revealed his role in manipulating the Sons of Yinsen, the sentient armor, and corrupting the Skin technology. Stark investigated an early military armor that had been distributed to rebel forces around the world. Temujin also made his presence felt, challenging Iron Man for the apparent death of his father, the Mandarin. The Avengers were disassembled eventually due to the actions of Scarlet Witch, who had become grotesquely unbalanced, and it led to the deaths of Ant-Man, Vision, and Hawkeye. During this time, Stark was manipulated by Scarlet Witch to suddenly threaten a Latvian ambassador at a UN meeting. Stark she made him be belligerently drunk. Because of this, it caused him to lose his job as a Secretary of Defense that the President had appointed him to. Additionally, Clarence Ward used stolen armor to kill nearly all of Stark Industries' board, and Rumiko Fujikawa, Stark's girlfriend, also died. In light of the incident, Stark resigned as Secretary of Defense. 6 months later, a massive breakout was executed at the Raft. While flying around the city, Iron Man arrived at the prison to aid Captain America, Luke Cage, Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, Matt Murdock, and the Sentry in keeping prisoners in after a prison break. Steve believed this event, the gathering of heroes by chance to fight a common foe, was a signal that the Avengers needed to be reformed. Tony was reluctant to make a new team, but eventually agreed. The new Avengers used the Stark Tower as their headquarters. So, eventually, Stark returned back to work, but he was working at a hectic pace. A former classmate of his asked for help, and a super soldier project named Extremis had been given to a small terrorist group. So Iron Man battled the augmented terrorist Malin, but suffered massive injuries. Being forced to use the Extremis on himself, Iron Man healed and found himself able to directly interface with technology, especially with his new armor. I know a lot of people aren't too keen on this as well, and this Extremis storyline is where they really got a lot of their influence for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I digress. I feel like this was a great storyline. This was one of my favorites as well, but I really enjoyed it. I felt like it was definitely a unique thing. I know a lot of people they drew criticism about how it kind of gave him superpowers, and that's kind of his whole thing, which I kind of agree with. His whole thing is that he's just a guy in a suit of armor. It's just kind of like the Bat family, like Batman, if he were to get superpowers, this is kind of like, okay, that's kind of not what Batman is. So I get it, but Extremis is a great storyline. But moving on, Stark learned of the government's plans to instigate a superhuman registration act that would force costume superpowered individuals to reveal their identities to the government and sign on as licensed agents. So he sought out to defeat the proposal initially, even going to such lengths as to hire Titanium Man to stage an attack at the hearing as he testified in order to manipulate the opinion towards his favor. After a disaster at Stamford, Connecticut involving the group of amateur heroes, the New Warriors, fighting supervillain Nitro, in which over 600 people died, mostly being children from a school, the public opinion against superhumans turned very quickly and fast-tracked the act into law. The new law split the hero community into two. Tony knew that with no major representative in favor of the SRA, the government would have applied harsh measures, and that going to the good old days wasn't an option. So he decided to provide a fairer path and lead the pro-registration forces himself. The anti-registration side was led by no other than Captain America. In his first major public action as a supporter, Stark again unmasked himself as Iron Man. As a part of measures to help ring in anti-registration forces, Iron Man, Yellow Jacket, and Reed Richards created the Prison 42 in the Negative Zone, a holding facility that was designed to contain rogue superheroes for as long as this superhero civil war lasted. It was a temporary measure because heroes could easily escape from prisons like the Raft. The trio also built a cyborg clone of Thor and used nanobots to control the Thunderbolts as a task force to hunt down unregistered heroes. During an ambush, the two oppositions were in mid-battle. Iron Man tried to reach a truce to stop fighting and work together to reach a middle ground, but Captain America rejected his proposal and attacked him, leading to a direct conflict between the two sides, during which the Thor clone malfunctioned and killed Goliath in cold blood. Events like this led Tony to doubt himself and what he stood for in that Civil War. People like Miriam Sharp, the mother of one of the victims of the Stamford incident, and Tony's best friend, Happy Hogan, would motivate him to carry on. Shortly after, Happy would be attacked by Spymaster in an attempt to get Iron Man to succumb to his injuries. He was rushed to a hospital and placed on life support, but died shortly afterwards. Prior to the events leading to Civil War, Stark assisted Spider-Man and his family quite heavily, which Peter Parker and Tony Stark, this was something from Civil War era that I thought they did a good job carrying over into the MCU. And I know so many people complained about the Spider-Man Homecoming being too Iron Man focused, and that Spider-Man was always able to do everything without Tony Stark. But, I mean, it's in the comics. So Peter Parker became to regard Tony as a mentor, and he became his assistant, and he even accepted a new technologically enhanced costume from him. The Iron Spider suit. So Stark also convinced Spider-Man to unmask as well and go public with his identity. Peter's feelings of being manipulated and unease about the rightness of Stark's cause grew until Stark revealed a prison for superhumans he and Mr. Fantastic had built in the Negative Zone. When Spider-Man attempted to escape Stark Tower after secretly moving his family out in order to join the Resistance, he attacked Stark, who had confronted him. However, due to Spider-Man's override of the suit given to him by Stark and some unexpected intervention by the Punisher, the web-slinger managed to escape and was now considered a traitor by Stark and the pro-registration side. And eventually, Captain America and Tony, there was one point where Cap just literally pummeled the crap out of Tony. I mean, it was bad, to the point to where Captain America realized the conflict was being tackled the wrong way, and he eventually surrendered. The anti-registration side was granted amnesty, with Cap agreeing to go on trial for his actions during the Civil War. While in custody, though, Captain America was killed in an assassination orchestrated by the Red Skull. Stark was devastated by his friend's death and left unsure on how to proceed. In a letter Steve had written before his death, he asked Tony to ensure that the Captain America legacy lived on and to look out for Bucky Barnes. Tony was instrumental in getting Bucky to assume the mantle of Captain America. So after everything had settled, Stark was then appointed the director position at S.H.I.E.L.D. because during the Civil War, Maria Hill had stepped down, citing that he had higher qualifications than her and the fact that it would piss the right people off. So Iron Man and the other Illuminati were responsible for exiling Hulk from Earth. They just launched him into space, and in doing so led to arguably some of the best Hulk storylines, like Planet Hulk, World War Hulk, that we've ever seen and we probably ever will see. But so once those had concluded, Hulk came back. He was pissed off, rightfully so, and he sought revenge on the people who launched him into space. Luckily, Stark saw this possibility as eventuality, like he knew it was going to happen, and was prepared to engage the Hulk with a brand new Hulkbuster armor. The battle between them destroyed most of New York City, and blows were thrown so powerful that no other hero could get close enough to help or act. Stark Tower collapsed on top of the two during the battle, and ultimately Hulk took Tony captive to the stadium with the rest of his captured heroes. Once all of Stark's sources were exhausted, he rendered the Hulk, who had been weakened from his fight with the Sentry, unconscious with orbiting military satellite lasers he helped install during his appointment as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And during the Skrull invasion, Stark's armor was infected by an alien cyber virus, which ultimately purged him of his Extremis virus. Stark discovered Spider-Woman herself was the Skrull Queen Viranki, I think I said that correctly, who nearly deceived him to join ranks with her. He was saved by Miss Marvel, who upon Tony's request left him with Black Widow, who acted as his defense until he could fix his damaged armor to a point to where it was fully functional. He led the heroes of New York against the Skrull invaders. However, his armor began to fail in midst of battle, forcing him to return back to Avengers Tower for another one. The President of the United States was less than reasonable regarding Stark's actions, and ultimately removed him as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and disbanded the entire agency altogether. And although the battle against the alien invasion was won, Tony had suffered great loss. His technology was non-functional, his corporations were just almost gone, he had many new enemies, and little to no allies willing to help him with any of his problems. So after the invasion, the US government also disbanded the Avengers, handing control of the Avengers Initiative over to Norman Osborn. So with Tony's Extremis powers failing, he was able to upload a virus that would destroy all records of the Registration Act, thus preventing Osborn from learning the identities of his fellow heroes. The only copy of the database remained in Stark's head, and while he was now on the run in one of his extra armor, his remaining armor in Stark Tower were now in Norman Osborn's hands. Iron Man managed to gain a new armor and fought Namor and Stark under sea base. Stark was able to outsmart the Atlantean and escape the collapsing base. Osborn then placed a bounty on Stark's head, offering mountains of gold to the Hood's gang. The members of the secret organization, the Cabal, gathered to discuss many issues, among which was the hunt for Tony Stark. So Tony, at this point, was losing his intelligence by the day, which slowed his thinking time, so his reaction was slower, and it caused him to not be able to pronounce difficult words correctly anymore. He started gathering and assembling parts to make his Iron Man suit easier to navigate and control, as it was becoming more and more difficult for him to do so. He later abandoned it for the Dynamo armor, which he borrowed from Dmitry Berkerin. Tony was later tracked down by Pepper, but the two were captured by Madame Mask. So, the thing that I thought was interesting is over the years, in each comic book run of Iron Man, they always try to get him back into earlier suits of armor, which I always find interesting, and it's always kind of just fan service, but at least like with this, like there was a reason for it. Like he needed each suit, as he was losing his intellect, he needed each suit to be easier. And then during the Siege of Asgard, Tony Stark was out of commission, but returned wearing an older version of his armor, disabling Norman Osborn's stolen Iron Patriot armor, and signaling the return of all three main Avengers, including Thor and Steve Rogers. He was instrumental in the defeat of the Void by ramming a Hammer helicarrier into the villain at full speed, weakening him, which gave Thor the chance for a kill shot. In the aftermath of Siege, the Superhuman Registration Act was repealed thanks to the efforts of Steve Rogers, who now took over the position of the overthrown Norman Osborn. So Iron Man, Thor, and Steve Rogers kind of rekindled their relationship while settling their past differences And Iron Man and Thor were assigned to Avengers alongside Bucky Barnes, posing as Captain America, while Steve Rogers headed the Secret Avengers. Iron Man was slightly troubled that he may not be able to take orders from Steve, but Steve told him that Maria Hill would oversee the Avengers. And with the help of Mr. Fantastic, Tony built a new model of armor and announced that he would make a new company, Stark Resilient, which is a pretty tight name, to rebuild his former wealth and to extend his repulsor technology as civilian energy source, pulling once again from making government weapons. Meanwhile, Sasha Hammer and Justine Hammer from Hammer Industries filled the gap in military technology left by Stark Industries with their own Detroit Steel armor. They attempted to sabotage Tony's attempts at testing and presenting new repulsor car developed by Stark Resilient, but failed. And Stark managed to save the event and even use it as a stunt to promote the repulsor car. And during the Serpent's bid to rule Earth, Tony fought Mach in the streets of Paris, where all citizens had been turned into statues. Finding himself unable to defeat Mach with conventional methods, Tony asked Odin to allow him to design magically powered weapons in the forges of Nidavellir. Once again, haunted by the casualties and his failure, Tony began drinking. Odin appeared, and after discussing with Tony, the Allfather proposed for him to create magical weapons at Nidavellir, a magical place. Tony, determined to not fail again, restored his sobriety again, and with these weapons the Avengers defeated the Serpents Worthy and Skadi, while Thor defeated the Serpent himself but paid with his life. Days later, Tony destroyed the weapons at Nidavellir, and after discussing with Odin, the god brought back to life the statues of the people from Paris who weren't broken. So the ones who had been broken, they were dead. So then there was like this huge storyline with the Mandarin and Stain again, and it was just this whole thing. It was okay. It was an okay storyline. But at the end of it all, Tony wanted to think about creating new technologies, wanted to think about his life as a whole, so he decided to take some time away, clear his mind, in the process going to outer space. And when Tony returned back to Earth, he created a new armor to test new technologies. After many aspects of his life were questioned upon defeating numerous people who got their hands on the extremist virus, Tony decided to accept the offer Star-Lord made to him, and he joined the Guardians of the Galaxy to explore the universe. And then, this was around the time the Guardians movie was being developed, the first one, so I kind of felt like this was just a way for them to kind of give Guardians some more credo again, which I was always I was personally a fan of the Guardians. I thought they were great. They were more B-list characters than anything, and I thought it was great that they were able to kind of pull them back up and put them in the forefront of Marvel again. I thought it was great. But during his voyage in space, Tony was faced by a rogue Rigelian recorder called 451, who claimed that he had met Tony's father and was the one responsible decades ago for allowing Tony to be born. The recorder revealed that he had supposedly genetically engineered Tony in womb, providing him with his intelligence and wits, and also that he modified Tony to let him be the only future pilot of a giant armor called Godkiller. Tony was forced into piloting the Godkiller, but somehow couldn't. 451 discovered his longtime plan had no profit and decided to destroy his consciousness along with the Godkiller. Tony managed to escape from the Godkiller with the brain-dead body of 451. Upon returning to Earth, Tony investigated why he couldn't pilot the Godkiller and discovered the hidden secret that he wasn't the baby 451 modified at all, but an adopted son used as a decoy to prevent 451 from finding the actual boy. And then this launched Superior Iron Man, which wasn't really one of my favorite storylines. Basically, Red Skull was the villain, and he was empowered by Charles Xavier's brain. Scarlet Witch and Doctor Doom cast an inversion spell to alter the moral axis of Skull's mind in order to defeat him, and was successful, and the Skull was beaten, but it also affected the moral compass of those who were present at the scene of the spell being used. And a reinversion spell with the purpose of getting everything back to normal would be cast, but Tony would avoid it by using a special shielding to escape the spell. He then relocated to San Francisco, where he secretly infected the entire city with a dormant version of the extremis virus via the water supply to make the achievement of perfection available for everyone in the city. He then created an app. The virus could be triggered inside an individual, giving the impression that the virus was downloadable. So Tony's second stage of this was, after a month of free extremis, he started charging each user of the app $99.99 a day for the renovation of the technology. After multiple battles with several heroic figures, including Daredevil, Pepper Potts, and an AI copy of an earlier non-inverted version of his mind, and the ally-turned-enemy Teen Abomination, Tony's utopian vision for San Francisco fell through on account of a public relations campaign run by Pepper that destroyed the faith San Francisco had in him, vilified Extremis 3.0, and revealed Tony Stark as the monster he'd become, forcing him to work without his friends if he wanted to secure his vision. So before Tony had his space journey, he met with the rest of the Illuminati to investigate a newly surfaced threat known as incursions, occurrences in which universes collided with their respective planet Earths as the focal point, and the only way to prevent the death of one's own Earth was to destroy the other. Because of this, the Illuminati had to prepare themselves for the prospect of killing an innocent planet for survival. In order to ensure that the threats of lesser importance could be handled accordingly so the Illuminati could focus on the incursions, Tony revamped and expanded the Avengers into a multi-purpose, versatile unit. Additionally, he constructed a Dyson sphere called Soul's Hammer in order to weaponize the sun, and helped reverse engineer the antimatter injection system. The futility of their efforts to tackle the incursions and the necessity to hide their knowledge of it from the rest of the world took an emotional toll on Tony, to the point that the Illuminati's ally Black Swan described him as a man coming to the end of himself. Early into the incursion crisis, Steve Rogers had denounced the acceptance of his fellow Illuminati of the prospect of destroying other worlds. His teammates wiped his memory from any knowledge about the incursions, but Rogers relearned about them after being exposed to the explosion of the Watcher's eye. Steve confronted Tony about this and declared the Illuminati public enemies. At this point, Iron Man had been affected by the inversion spell, an attempt at reclaiming Wakanda from the cabal that Namor had created to destroy and curse of Earths resulted in Tony being held captive in the necropolis. After the cabal had been apparently killed following a truce made by S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Illuminati returned to Necropolis and freed Tony, who was forced to flee due to the Illuminati's unwillingness to let Stark be there with them when they met Rogers and the Avengers to prevent old fires from being stoked. When the Shi'ar and their allies arrived at Earth in order to destroy it, it was the focal point of the multiverse's decay, the Avengers and the Illuminati tried to retaliate against the enemy fleet, but they were unsuccessful. As they ran out of options very fast, Iron Man flew to Soul's Hammer in order to use it. He successfully destroyed the Shi'ar fleet, saving the Earth, but the final incursion was on the horizon. With only a few minutes before the event, Steve confronted Tony to settle it. The ensuing fight between the two old friends led Steve to force Tony to admit that he had lied to him and all of their allies when he had known about the incursions all along. But Tony had also confessed that he wouldn't change a thing. The final incursion started, and Earth 1610's planet Earth started approaching Earth 616's planet Earth, while Tony and Steve kept fighting. Earth 1610's shield launched a full invasion to destroy Earth 616, and Tony and Steve were crushed by a helicarrier. The two Earths ultimately collided, destroying each of the universes. Then, miraculously, when Earth 616 was brought back to existence, any sign of Tony's moral inversion had disappeared, returning to his normal self. 8 months into the future, Tony made an unlikely ally in the allegedly reformed Victor Von Doom during an adventure investigating the returned Madame Mask. Doom became a key player in Mask's defeat and continued supporting Stark, much to Tony's skepticism. Soon later, the superhero community was divided once again upon learning the existence of an Inhuman named Ulysses Kane, who had the ability to profile the future. Tony opposed Captain Marvel's idea of actively using Ulysses' ability to preemptively tackle any threats, suggesting it was dangerous to take his visions for granted for several reasons. Stark also brought into the question the morality of stopping and punishing somebody for a disaster they could potentially do and might not even know that they would do. Shortly after the initial tension between Captain Marvel and Tony's ideas, Stark decided to begin a search on the identity of his biological parents, which met him to many dead ends. Following his family reunion, the tension between him and Captain Marvel increased, resulting from two different occasions when Shahid Kane's visions resulted in tragedy. The first one was War Machine died and She-Hulk was put in a coma during a preemptive ambush on Thanos. Later, Bruce Banner was murdered by Hawkeye, allegedly the split second before he was going to transform into the Hulk. When Banner was being interrogated due to one of Kane's visions, foreseeing him hulking out with catastrophic consequences, Captain Marvel eventually arrested an innocent finance banker named Allison Green based on nothing more than a vision from Kane that turned out to be wrong. Iron Man enlisted the help of several superheroes who opposed profiling to attack and rescue Green. The ensuing battle between Iron Man and Captain Marvel's forces was cut short when a new vision announced Captain America's death at the hands of the new Spider-Man, Miles Morales, at the steps of the Capitol building. Black Panther subsequently deflected Captain Marvel's side publicly, giving Iron Man and his allies enough time to teleport away. Iron Man and Captain Marvel came to blows one last time after both Spider-Man and Captain America traveled to Washington, D.C. to prove the vision wrong. Tony lost the fight and slipped into a coma. Again. Surviving slowly due to secret alterations he had done to his body, keeping him alive. Again. His body was placed in a stasis pod. Again. Where Beast set out to investigate his condition. Meanwhile, Kane's powers had evolved beyond the ability of human comprehension, and he left the Earth to join other cosmic entities. And eventually there was, after Tony's fall, Victor Von Doom decided to take up Iron Man's mantle himself in order to establish his new position as a hero and carry on Stark's legacy. A digital copy of Stark's mind became active and located Riri Williams, who was a prodigy teenager with affinity for suits of armor who had caught Tony's attention shortly before the war. At the request of Tony's will, Amanda Armstrong became the CEO of Stark Industries to prevent the company from falling in the hands of its board of directors. Tony's comatose body was taken to Stark Industrial Complex, and Tony's biological system eventually rebooted itself, resulting in his awakening. He disappeared from the Stark facility and went into hiding until he fully recovered, only approaching his mother once to ensure he was safe. After performing the necessary procedures to kickstart Rhodey's biological system, Tony returned him to life. Rhodey joined Tony in fighting the Hood to prevent Stark Industries from falling in his hands. Tony subsequently took down his own biological father, Jude, who had stepped out of the shadows after decades of keeping his resurrection at the hands of Hydra a secret. Not long after making his return official, Tony rebranded his company yet again as Stark Unlimited, a think tank that doubled as an ideas incubator for new suits, turning Iron Man into a collaborative project, which additionally returned to the idea of creating a specific armor depending on the situation. And that is pretty much the comics in a nutshell. So basically, throughout the years, Tony is just kind of a complicated character. You know, initially he was a person who only cared about fame and wealth and booty and women, and he had no sense of responsibility. And this all changed when he was captured and he had to fight for his life. He had to fight for survival. He had to fight and avenge someone who he looked up to. And he realized the kind of person that he was truly, and engaged in a life of heroism to atone for his past mistakes. And despite all of his downfalls, which, are womanizing, his pride, God, he's so prideful, and most of all, his alcoholism, he's devoted to make the world a better place. And this desire has sometimes caused him to resort to morally questionable methods, as long as the end justifies the means, including his crusade to safeguard his technology, the Civil War, both of them. But Tony has also shown that he can feel guilt over those types of actions, which developed into self-hatred. And he's been described in the comic as man enough to do what needs to be done, even knowing full well what it may cost him. So his self-hating tendencies have also led him to being borderline suicidal and undervaluing his own life, especially in favor of others. And he's definitely shown in the comics that he doesn't really like taking people's lives and only resorts to killing people as an extreme measure. So required, or recommended reading, I should say, for Iron Man, I would definitely start with Demon in a Bottle, which is issue 128. The Armor Wars, I would highly recommend as well. And the issue 282, which is the first War Machine issue, which was really, really well done. Civil War and Extremist, definitely those for sure. So now, focusing on Tony in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I'll kind of just do this briefly because I feel like this is a more common version of Tony Stark that people are familiar with. So I'll just do a brief rundown of all the storylines that we've seen him in. So in Iron Man 1, we see his origin, which is pretty on par with his origin in the Marvel comics. And then we see him in Iron Man 2, which we see him fight against Whiplash, which is kind of a mix between the Hammer story arc mixed with Whiplash, with Stark Industries being outbid on stuff, and then we see the government trying to take control of the Iron Man suits, stating that it's not something that civilians should have power of. And then we see him in Avengers, where it's the classic team up. This is right around the time because Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2, Tony is still extremely cocky. He's still that playboy lifestyle. He's still just kind of a dick. And in Avengers, we really see him start to mature and realize that he's not a leader and that he needs to learn how to be a team player. And then we see him in Iron Man 3 dealing with the Mandarin, which I know it wasn't everyone's choice of if they were to have the story play out the way it did with it being a fake Mandarin or whatever, but I thought it was really great, and I really enjoyed Iron Man 3, mainly because it really dived deep into his demons. But in the MCU, they don't really touch on his alcoholism, which I think they were originally going to because Iron Man 1 came out before the Disney buyout of Marvel, and I feel like they were really going to try to touch on that because he was drinking quite heavily in Iron Man and even in Iron Man 2. And so with the acquisition of Marvel to Disney, Disney obviously doesn't want their heroes to be alcoholics. So they went the route of PTSD, because at the end of Avengers, Tony almost dies saving the Earth from the Chitauri and from Loki and Thanos' attack on Earth. And so he has PTSD from that. And so that's where that was, going after Avengers. And then we see him in Age of Ultron, and it kind of just further perpetuates his PTSD. We see him trying to build this essentially a response shield around the Earth with his we see his little in the comics they were called Mandroids, but it's his Ultron initiative. He creates Ultron, and because Scarlet Witch makes him see a vision of Thanos destroying all the Avengers and taking over the Earth. And so it's his PTSD, it's his need to try to protect the ones that he cares about kicking in again. And then we see him in Captain America Civil War, and it's kind of the same thing again, where he's, this was a more watered down version of what the comics were. There was a lot of stuff going on in the comics. There was a lot of heroes in the comics. And I felt like for being on the big screen, it was a good idea to have it kind of just narrowed down. And I really liked how I said earlier how they meshed Bucky's storyline with being Winter Soldier with Tony's, with like his parents dying in the car crash and how those overlapped and intertwined. I thought that was really well done. It was really smart of the Russo brothers to do it that way. And Kevin Feige, I'm assuming he had a hand in that as well. We see him dealing again with the loss of his parents and how that affected him. And then we see him again in Spider-Man Homecoming, which kind of touches on pre-Civil War in the comics, like I mentioned, of how Peter Parker and Tony Stark had that father-son mentor type relationship. And we see that in Homecoming. We see that how he tries to help guide Peter Parker. And then we see him again in Avengers Infinity War. We see that same mentality of him trying to protect those that he loves, protect people, because he didn't want Peter even anywhere near where he was going on Titan. So, and then he was extremely upset that he tagged along anyway. And then now we have Avengers Endgame. So that comes out in just a couple weeks. And that's why I'm doing this episode, because I wanted people to get the history of my favorite character of Iron Man and why I feel like he's such a great hero and a very tragic hero. And because like I said at the very beginning, he puts up this shield, like this suit of armor to hide and mask the fact that there's a lot of internal stuff going on. And they really touched on that in Iron Man 3, because he was literally just like building suit after suit after suit of armor, like nonstop. So this concludes the MCU part of my History of Iron Man episode. And now I'm going to answer some Iron Man questions from listeners. So Colt wants to know what Iron Man's thoughts and opinions on the most successful and greatest Marvel hero, the Punisher, would be. I kind of feel like this is something I can delve a little deeper into. First of all, I don't feel like Tony would be keen on the Punisher because, like I said earlier, Tony has he doesn't want to kill unless he absolutely has to kind of mentality, whereas the Punisher will just dole out carnage. So I don't feel like they would get along very well. And Arturo wanted to know why in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in Captain America Civil War, why didn't Iron Man kill Captain America and Bucky? So, this kind of mirrors what I was saying about the whole Frank Castle thing. Tony doesn't like to kill unless he absolutely has to. And I feel like he was more so just acting out in anger more than anything, and retaliation for his parents being murdered. So I don't feel like he would have killed Bucky or Tony or Steve. So this concludes this episode of the Nerd Herders history of Iron Man. So I hope you enjoyed it. I totally plan on doing more, at least once a month, trying to do one. I hope it was enjoyable. I hope it was educational and informative, and that it gives you a little bit of knowledge of Iron Man going into Avengers Endgame. So, I guess I should have done this at the beginning, but I'll do it now. Here's some housekeeping. So I will be at VisionCon in Springfield, Missouri, May 10th and 11th. So once again, if you will be there, if you are attending, hit me up and we can hang out. We can grab a snack. We can grab a drink. We can maybe possibly do a D&D one-shot. I know they're doing some tabletop games there. That'd be pretty rad. So just hit me up. Let me know. And I have a guest lined up, and I will announce probably in the next week or so. I'm still kind of panning out the details. And once that gets 100% confirmed, I will announce who it is. She's a pretty cool chick, and she's been doing a lot for the tabletop RPG/D&D community. So thought it would be cool to highlight someone who's been giving a lot back to the community. So, like I said, I will announce that in probably the next week or so. So this concludes this episode of the Scruffy Looking Nerdhers. This one was definitely a longer one, but thank you so much for sticking with me till the end. I appreciate your support so much. If you like what you heard, be sure to like, follow, subscribe, leave a review. If you leave a 5-star review, it helps the algorithm on iTunes and bumps me up so more people can see it. And be sure to share with your friends, your family, in Facebook groups, on Reddit, on Discord. You can get the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, YouTube, the whole 9 yards. There's so many ways to listen, and be sure to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at SLNH Podcast, and be sure to pick up some merch. I will leave a link in the description below. And thank you so much for your reviews and your comments, your direct messages, all that stuff. It really helps me grow the podcast, and I enjoyed talking with you guys about stuff. It's so great. I appreciate you guys so much. But everyone, this is Tyler from the Scruffy Looking Nerd Herders Podcast signing off, and may the Force be with you.
Is it better to be feared or respected? And I say, is it too much to ask for both?